Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? I think you can. Hold your hands up if it's not audible at the back. Very happy to be here to introduce my new novel, Sweet Caress. This is actually my first event, so I'm fresh, not jaded, and very happy to introduce the book to you, which I have here in my hand. I might read a couple of paragraphs to you in due course. But I thought that the interesting thing to do before I read a page or two would be to tell you a little bit about how the book evolved. I always think that's what's intriguing for non-writers or would-be writers, or perhaps current writers, to find out how one particular novelist arrives at writing a novel. This is my 14th novel, so I suppose I qualify as an old pro now, but they all start in the same sort of way, the glimmering of an idea, and that half-formed idea begins to develop. In this case, it's hindsight that provides the clue to why I decided to write this quite long novel, 450 pages, about a woman photographer in the 20th century. I realized that I've, over my longish career, written two what I call full-life novels, novels that deal with a character's life from cradle to grave. It's quite a tricky thing to do, technically, because you can't actually write a whole life in a novel and keep that novel under 2,000 pages. So structurally, it poses certain problems. The first time I tackled it was in 1987, when I wrote a novel called The New Confessions, which followed the career of a film director called John James Todd. And it takes the form of a kind of fake autobiography. John James Todd is looking back on his life and reflecting on his misfortunes and his good fortunes. He's born in 1899, and by the time we reach the end of the novel, it's the mid-1970s. Actually, now I think about it, I have written 4 full-life novels, but the second one I tackled was an art hoax. I wrote a fake biography of a fake artist called Nat Tate. He had a short, unhappy life. He was born in 1928 and committed suicide in 1960. So his life only spanned about 80 pages, but it is a full-life novel. So that maybe that's a little footnote before I moved on to my next long novel, which you may have heard of. It's called Any Human Heart. And this time, instead of having tackled autobiography and biography, I decided to write the novel in the form of a series of intimate journals. And this central character of this novel is called Logan Mountstuart, and he kept a journal throughout most of his life. It picks up his story when he's about a 17-year-old schoolboy and ends at the end of the 20th century when he's a very old man in his late 80s. That's probably the longest novel I've written. And I then sort of stopped writing these full-life novels for a few years and wrote a couple of spy novels. I wrote a James Bond novel. And there will be a chance to ask me questions about any of these later on if you want to. And whenever I'm writing a novel, any particular novel, I always have in my head a couple of ideas, or sometimes 3 ideas, of the next novel I might write. And this is a kind of fear, in a way, a preemptive strike against writer's block. I find that the idea of not being able to write or not having an idea is utterly terrifying. I have friends of mine, very successful novelists, who've endured 7 or 8 years of writer's block. And for my own peace of mind, I find that if I'm writing a novel and I have the notions of other novels, other potential novels in my head, I relax a bit. And in the case of this novel, Sweet Caress, the glimmering idea that was there in my head was that, having written the lives of 2 men, I should really write the full life of a woman. And that was the basic idea I had. And the reason I thought of that with some confidence was that I have written from the point of view of a woman several times, in fact. I quite like changing sex for the duration of a novel. And I've written 3 novels from the point of view of a woman. And so contemplating what I might do next, this was after my novel called Waiting for Sunrise, which is a World War I spy novel. I thought I should try and write the full life, cradle to grave story of a woman, and in the 20th century, because this century is barely advanced, and so I thought I would write the story of a woman's life in the 20th century. And what happens after that, that's the basic idea. And then what takes place thereafter is a kind of question and answer session that's very protracted. I ask myself a question, maybe a very simple question like, what's her name? And the answer I get to that question provides another 3 questions, and they answer those 3 questions, and so on exponentially. The question and answers go on, and I begin to amass an aggregate of information about this character. So very early on I thought, well, I'm going to start somewhere at the beginning of the 20th century, and her name was going to be Amory Clay. And then one of the first questions I asked myself after that was, well, what's she going to do in her life? And I'd become very intrigued by photography. I take photographs. Everybody in the world takes photographs now. I read somewhere that there were 30 billion selfies taken last year. So how many other billions of photographs join that 30 billion? It's unimaginable. Another statistic I heard was that last year more photographs were taken than in the entire history of photography. And yet, there's something about photography that is not just a kind of monstrous profusion of fleetingly glimpsed images that are then forgotten. There are photographs that stay with us, that beguile us, that shock us, that resonate. And what is it about that photographic image that makes a photograph great, that makes it a work of art? Because I do think photography is an art form. There are some people who disagree with that, but my own feelings is that, you know, there are photographs that I remember as vividly as great paintings or as great pieces of music. They form part of my personal cultural pantheon. Therefore, surely photography deserves to be considered as an art form if those images have that kind of resonance. The two other aspects about photography that intrigued me. One is that we can all take a great photograph. It's a very democratic art form. Anybody with a bit of luck, and admittedly being in the right place at the right time, can take a photograph as good as Cartier-Bresson or as Jacques-Henri Lartigue. It's a very democratic form that admits all applicants. And the other thing, as I did my research, is I realized that it's also very egalitarian. In the history of photography, particularly as it developed in the early 20th century, there was no glass ceiling. Women were as readily admitted into the profession as men. And in Europe, before the First World War, there were many very successful women professional photographers. And in the interwar period, again, largely in Europe, many women had as successful a career as men. This is not true in the other art forms necessarily, or indeed other professions. It took a long time for women to achieve that equal status, and indeed some might argue that there's still a struggle to maintain that or to achieve it. But in photography, women were able to thrive alongside their male counterparts from very early on in the 20th century. So I thought, continuing or picking up on my question and answer session, I thought it would be very interesting to take my woman protagonist, Amory Clay, who I'd named by now, and make her a professional photographer. And there are all sorts of other reasons why that was useful to me, because the profession would allow her to be independent and allow her to travel and allow her to visit all sorts of historical periods and geographical locales that intrigued me. By making her a woman photographer, I was able to fill out a life in a way that I might not have been able to do had she been, say, a teacher or a civil servant. So the profession of woman photographer became Amory's profession. She starts off in the early 1920s working as an assistant for her uncle, who's a society photographer, rather in the Cecil Beaton mode, taking the beau monde of London society. He takes photographs of the Prince of Wales, for example. And Amory's career as a photographer, leaping ahead somewhat, allows her to start off as a society photographer, then become a kind of social commentator in the way that, say, a photographer like Brassai was in France. She decides to create a scandal. She wants to become notorious, and so she goes to Berlin to take prostitutes in Berlin in the 1920s. And her career, and I won't spoil the novel for you for those who haven't read it, but her career follows in a way the sort of development of the photographic profession in the 20th century. She takes fashion photography, and she ends up as a war photographer, which was perhaps the one area of photography that was slow to admit women, though one of the most famous women photographers is a woman called Gerda Taro, who was who was a war photographer in the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s, and she died actually in a stupid and tragic accident when she was taking photographs of a battle between the fascists and Republican forces. She jumped on a car and was being sped away from the battlefield, and something went wrong with the car and it crashed into a tank, and she was crushed to death. And one wonders that had Gerda Taro, she was in her late 20s then, had she survived, she might have become the first truly great woman war photographer. She's sort of been resurrected in latter years, but in a way she was the first woman to take photographs of a combat zone, and should be recognized as that, because the woman we've all heard of who's taken war photographs was Lee Miller. Lee Miller was an American, but her whole artistic training and her whole artistic credo, if you like, was developed in France. So she's a sort of pseudo-European. But she was one of the few women war photographers who took photographs in World War II and famously was one of the first photographers into Hitler's Eagle's Nest, Berchtesgaden in Austria. And those famous photographs she took sitting in Hitler's bath, ones that we're all familiar with. Anyway, my photographer Amory sort of follows that pattern and becomes a war photographer in World War II and then on, and winds up her professional career in Vietnam in the 1960s. So I follow the development of the history of photography through Amory Clay. And one of the things I've done in this novel, which I think is unprecedented, is I've included 73 photographs. Photographs have appeared in novels from time to time, but usually half a dozen or so, and often they're just symbolic. Piece of driftwood on a beach, or an open gate leading to a country lane or something like that. But because I had chosen Amory's career as a photographer, I thought I had an opportunity here to do something which is another plan, a program, ambition of mine, which I, again, with hindsight, realize I've been pursuing since 1987, to try and push fiction into the world of the real, to try and blur the boundary between what is made up and what seems real. Because it's one of the paradoxes of life, is that truth is very hard to grasp, and the various media we have that purport to tell the truth are often as manipulated and as shaped as anything fictitious. And particularly that's particularly true when it comes to human beings, because the human beings are opaque. Even people as close to you as your children, your spouse, your parents, who seem terribly familiar, actually are mysterious. Nobody really knows what's going on in anybody's head. And one of the ways of finding out what makes us tick, what makes us function and thrive or not on this curious adventure we're all on, this journey from cradle to grave, is to read novels, because novels enshrine truths. Again, this is the paradox, because they can be verified, because the truths that are in a novel originate in the mind of the novelist, and everything that's written down is absolutely non-contradictory, because that's what the novelist has decided. So if you want to know what people are thinking, if you want to know how people function in run-of-the-mill situations or in extraordinary situations, I would suggest that the best thing to do is to read a novel, because there you'll get access to people's inner lives in a way that's unequivocal and absolutely verifiable, or rather non-verifiable, in the sense that you don't need to verify it because the novelist says this is the case. So this enterprise I've embarked on in writing these 3 long life novels is an attempt to say, this is what lives are like, this is what people feel when they fall in love, or when they're disappointed, or when tragedy strikes. And I've tried to enhance that situation, which exists in fiction anyway, by pushing my fictions into the world of what you would regard as non-fiction, history, journalism, reportage, biography, autobiography. And I realized, looking back, that as I said at the beginning, I've written a fake autobiography, a fake biography, a fake literary journal. And now, in Sweet Caress, I think I've gone another step further in writing an entirely fictitious life, but illustrating it with photographs of these fictitious people. So how did that come about? All the photographs in Sweet Caress, the 73 photographs I've chosen, are anonymous. They're known as found photographs. I have quite a collection myself, which I bought over the years at junk shops or car boot sales or at antique fairs in France. And I don't know who took these photographs or who is in them. They've effectively been discarded, I suppose. They've either been thrown away or they've been sold for pennies. So whoever owned them at one stage, or whoever families were in them, or whoever the personages in these photographs were, have decided to get rid of them and sell them. So I have bought them. I bought about 2,000 photographs altogether, I think, over the 2 years or so that I was planning Sweet Caress. And from those 2,000, I made this very small selection. And I've in a way revivified those people in the photographs, because I have named them and dated them and given them a context. And whoever they were then, they are now my creatures. They are the people that populate the novel of Sweet Caress. And I think a lot of people have read the novel by now, even though today is publication day, by the way. A lot of people have read the novel now, and the curious effect of reading a work of fiction and seeing a photograph of a character in that novel doesn't detract from the fiction. It seems in a curious way to enhance it. So you're reading about a character, you turn the page and there's a photograph of them. And it makes this is the fourth version, if you like, of my random attempt to colonize the real. It makes my fiction seem strangely non-fictional. It makes the characters in my novel seem to have a life, if you like, beyond the pages of the novel. Anyway, you readers will be the ultimate judge of it, but that was the original plan. I've done it before. I had in my art hoax of Nat Tate, I used anonymous photographs. So I had a dry run, if you like. But in Sweet Caress, I've really pushed this new development to, I think, an unprecedented length, and have illustrated this long novel with many, many black and white photographs. Some of them, I think, are really good photographs. I found astonishing anonymous photographs in my long search, photographs that you could hang in a gallery. And it's a curious counterbalance to the monstrous profusion of digital images that we have today, that somehow these strange one-off black and white images have a curious power to move or to register with us. Anyway, I thought I would give you a very short reading of the novel, just to give you a flavor of what I was talking about, and it's to do with photography, aptly. It's the very first page of the novel. And after I've finished reading, maybe we could have a question and answer session. Do feel free to ask me about anything about the writing life, not necessarily about this latest novel, which I'm sure has not been read by many of you, if any at all, but any of my other novels or any other aspects of the writing life you might be intrigued by, because I've done all sorts of writing. I've written films and television, short films. I've written a lot of journalism. I've started writing for the theatre. My second play is coming on in March next year at Hampstead Theatre. Tickets will go on sale shortly. So I've had a kind of diverse writing life. So if you're curious about any of these aspects of it, don't hesitate to ask me and I'll do my level best to answer. But let me just read a short couple of paragraphs from the opening of Sweet Caress. There's no real need to set this up, but the novel structure is Amory Clay is an elderly lady in her 69th year, approaching her 70th birthday, and her life has reached a kind of crisis point, and this has provoked her to look back on her past and its ups and downs and its successes and failures and the rackety roller coaster aspect of her 70 years and 10 on this small planet circling an insignificant star. And her first reflection is to look back at the very first photograph she took, which was in 1915, when she was a young girl with her first small camera. And this is what she took, and this is what she thinks. What drew me down there, I wonder, to the edge of the garden? I remember the summer light, the trees, the bushes, the grass luminously green, basted by the bland, benevolent late afternoon sun. Was it the light? But there was the laughter also, coming from where a group of people had gathered by the pond. Someone must have been horsing around, making everyone laugh. The light and the laughter then. I was in the house, in my bedroom, bored, with the window open wide so I could hear the chatter of conversation from the guests, and then the sudden arpeggio of delighted laughter came that made me slip off my bed and go to the window to see the gentlemen and the ladies and the marquee and the trestle tables laid out with canapes and punch bowls. I was curious. Why were they making their way towards the pond? What was the source of this merriment? So I hurried downstairs to join them. And then, halfway across the lawn, I turned and ran back to the house to fetch my camera. Why did I do that? I think I have an idea, now, all these years later. I wanted to capture that moment, that benign congregation in the garden on a warm summer evening in England, to capture it and imprison it forever. Somehow I sensed I could stop time's relentless motion and hold that scene, that split second, with the ladies and the gentlemen in their finery, as they laughed, careless and untroubled. I would catch them fast, eternally, thanks to the properties of my wonderful machine. In my hands, I had the power to stop time, or so I fancied. I think that, in a way that encapsulates what I feel is the essential strength of photography, and some of you might disagree with me, but I think what makes photography special, and this may seem to diminish it somewhat, but it is a democratic art form, is the snapshot. Only photography can do this. It's a stop time device. And I think that when I think of the photographs that stay with me, that are memorable, it is because they have frozen the moment of time and have somehow distilled a moment. And there are other ideas I have, whether photographs should be monochrome essentially, or should not try to mimic the conventions of the fine arts, particularly Beaux-Arts classicism. But I think that the snapshot is in essence what makes photography great, and why we take photographs, and why they haunt us. And it's not to be sniffed at. I think it's a remarkable thing that we have created in the camera, and it needn't just be on film, analog. It can be digital as well, but I think that's what makes us take photographs and makes photographs meaningful to us. They stop time, and this is something that Amory comes to realize at the end of her life as she looks back on it. Anyway, that's a very rough sketch of how the novel took shape, and gives you some idea of its scope and its ambitions, and also its larger themes. So I would now say it's over to you. Any questions, and I'll happily respond to them. Anybody got anything they'd like to ask me? Yes?
Thank you. That was so interesting. Thank you very much. I was just going to ask about your James Bond novel. When you were writing it, did you envision Bond as yourself, or was it perhaps a character that's, an actor that's played the role?
No, I certainly wouldn't envisage him as me. It's a good question, actually, because it was a very interesting job to be asked to do, and I was I did a tremendous amount of research in the original Ian Fleming novels, and I decided to set my novel in 1969, when Bond would have been 45 years old, according to Ian Fleming. According to Ian Fleming, James Bond was born in 1924, so in 69 he'd be 45, and again, according to Fleming, when you're 45 and an 00 with a license to kill, that's when you're retired. So in a way, my Bond in my novel was at the potential end of his career as 007. You know, he might have gone on to do some other form of espionage, but he was on the point of losing his license to kill. And so he's a middle-aged man. He's had one hell of a life. And so it was an interesting moment to contemplate what kind of a man he was. And again, because I did so much research into Fleming's novels, Fleming is very specific about what Bond looked like. So I ignored all the Bond actors over the years, and I've actually know 3 of them. I've worked with 3 of them, Sean Connery, Pierce Brosnan, and Daniel Craig. But I ignored all of them and their various physiognomies, because Fleming was very precise about what his James Bond looked like. I'm sure hardly any of you have heard of the American singer-songwriter Hoagy Carmichael, but Fleming says in the Bond novels on 3 occasions that James Bond looked like the American singer Hoagy Carmichael. He was an actor, so he's in a few films. He was a tall, rangy man with a very dark complexion and dark black hair, handsome. So when Fleming was writing Bond, he had the image of this real person, Hoagy Carmichael, in mind. And so when I was writing my Bond, I thought of Hoagy Carmichael as well. And bizarrely, my father was a great fan of Hoagy Carmichael, so I listened to Hoagy Carmichael as I was growing up, and I even have an old vinyl disc of Hoagy Carmichael with a fine picture of him. But you can find images of him on the internet very easily, and you'll see how he could quite easily be a James Bond figure. I suppose you would say that Connery probably resembles him the most, but also Timothy Dalton bears a certain resemblance to Hoagy Carmichael. But I had the image of that singer in mind as I wrote my James Bond, of my aging spy, contemplating the end of his adventures. And it was quite useful, actually. I don't make it specific, but it was quite interesting to bring him to mind rather than the images from the movies which dominate everybody's impressions of Bond. I went back to the novels, I went back to Fleming's original conception and stuck with that.
Thank you very much indeed. Are you prepared for one of your creations to come back to life and to receive a missive telling you that that is Great Uncle Bill or something of that nature?
Oh, you mean in the photographs?
Of the photos.
Well, I would quite like that, actually. And I've done some investigation about the legal ramifications of using these found photographs. I think that most of the people in the photographs I use must be dead, so that's not an issue. But towards the end of the novel, as the novel gets into the 1970s and the photographs that appear in the 1970s, it's entirely conceivable that some of the anonymous people in the novel are alive and are, men and women in their, 70s or 80s. There's no legal problem, apparently, unless I said they were, dangerous criminals or slandered them in some way. But because I haven't stolen these images, they were thrown away or sold, so they belong to me, the purchaser. But I would be quite interested if somebody came forward and said, that's my Uncle Harry or my Auntie Jean, or that's me even. But I haven't made any identification that would be offensive. So there's no cause for complaint. And how the photographs came to be in my hands is another matter, is a matter for them. But they belong to me now, and so I can use them as I see fit. So I would be intrigued if somebody, I don't want to spoil the novel for anyone who hasn't read it, but certainly there are pictures of young people in the 1970s towards the end of the novel who entirely conceivably could be alive today and might be amazed to pick up the book and find a picture of their younger selves in it. But there's nothing that would cause upset or offense in the identities that I've given them. Yes?
Good evening. Following on from that last question, with respect to the people in those photographs, have you considered, as with the Nat Tate expose, etc., what happened, setting up an exhibition of a public exhibition of the photographs?
Yes, I have actually. You're way ahead of me.
That would then enable the public internationally to maybe put names to the people in those photographs?
Well, I think, that may happen, but I have thought of producing a little coffee table book of the collected photographs of Amory Clay and presenting them as it were her photographs, rather than try to find out the identity of the real people in the photographs. Nat Tate's a very interesting example because there is one photograph of Nat Tate which I put on the cover of the book, and it has been disseminated throughout the world since 1998, and nobody has come forward to identify this very distinctive, handsome man who I decided to call Nat Tate. So I wonder if it would happen, but I think there's a sense there is a kind of Nat Tate dimension to Sweet Caress, in that I could further the career of Amory Clay, the photographer, and present her work to the world as if she were a real photographer who I've discovered.
That was the next follow-up
Yeah.
question I was going to ask you. Thank you.
Yeah. Here at the front, yeah.
Hello. you gave the hint already, so you have several ideas for the next novel project.
Yes.
And this is my first question. My follow-up question is, have you ever thought about expanding on things like you did in Brazzaville Beach, where you made some very sensible comments making up the character of the mathematician. So you seem to be interested in mathematics and the kind of psychology of being a mathematician. So any thoughts of going deeper into that?
Well, I don't know. I get these enthusiasms and I explore them. The mathematician in Brazzaville Beach is actually my second mathematician. In my novel, The New Confessions, there's another mathematician, and that was New Confessions was 1987, Brazzaville Beach was 1990. So there's about a 3 or 4 year fascination with the higher reaches of mathematics and of physics, and also the personalities of these people who can operate and understand these concepts. But it's sort of dwindled now, so I doubt that I'll explore that again. But I have thought of writing sequels or carrying on some of my novels, but I think I'll save that for my very old age when I've run out of ideas and can't think of anything to write. I've always thought of writing a sequel to my very first novel, A Good Man in Africa. And I tend to leave my novels as very open-ended anyway. I don't believe in tying up every loose end and in a neat knot. I think life isn't like that, so your realistic fiction shouldn't be like that. I leave them very open, so there's a potential for a sequel or a potential for further investigation. I mean, you're right, Brazzaville Beach, what happens to Hope Clearwater, the heroine at the center? She's still a young woman, but I doubt I'll ever write about the further adventures of my various characters. I've always got too many ideas and too many other things that I want to write about, so I leave them open, but I don't think I'll exploit them. Yes, Sylvia?
This is about Any Human Heart, and it had an incredibly profound effect on me at the time I read it, and I gave it to friends of mine, just saying, you've got to read this, and they'd say, why? And I said, just read it. And it had a similarly profound effect on many of them. I mean, one of them just read it all night. That kind of but it's a quiet book. I know some fairly sad things happen, but it's a quiet book. It's an episodic book. What made you write that? Where did that come from? Where did Any Human Heart come from?
Well, again, it was a very specific idea to write another full life. And I keep a journal. I've kept a journal. I started writing a journal, an intimate journal, a private diary when I was 18 years old, and I stopped at 21 and I started again at 27. I've kept going ever since. So I have this document, which must be some millions of words long now, which is just an account of my life. It's not deep thoughts or anything, just an account of my working life and the things that happened to me. And it struck me that the journal form, which is a literary form, is actually how we live. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know that person we met in the pub last night is going to be our future wife or husband. The future is a blur, a void. But most novels are actually very highly structured and very knowing and shaped. So the basic idea for Any Human Heart was, could I write a long novel about one man's life in this format, in the journal format? And it's quite rare. There are a few novels written as journals, but they're much shorter than mine. So that was the technical challenge, and I think that's why it affects you, because as you read about Logan Mountstuart's life and as it unfolds, you are exactly in the same position as him, And indeed, he is in exactly the same position as you, the reader. You do not know what's going to happen in the future. And so as you read, as Logan's life unfolds and unspools, you live it with him. And you know, life is boring. Life has its unsatisfactory moments. Occasionally it's exciting. Occasionally you might meet somebody interesting. So there was a lot of artifice in trying to make it seem artless and random. But I have a feeling that it was because it was written as a journal. This, you know, it's a 500-page novel written as a journal. It starts in Logan was born in 1906 and dies in 1992, I think. So he lives through every decade of the 20th century. But there are great tracts of his life when he's very poor. He has success early in life. He has great tragedy. He makes mistakes. But you live his life as he lives it, and that's entirely because it's written as an intimate journal. You know, he talks about going to the dentist, or he talks about feeling sick when he has to, you know, meet somebody important. So there's all the random little details of everybody's life is somehow in his life, and I think that's why it has an effect. If I'd written it as an orthodox novel, I don't think it would have been as powerful. And so that was where the idea came from, and that was my. It was somehow because I keep a journal. And I reread it. It's a fascinating document. And I'm a great reader of other journals, you know, famous writers like Pepys or Kilvert. There are very famous diaries that are classics of literature, which are very compelling. Boswell, another one, Dr. Johnson's biographer. I've read a lot of journals, and the idea came to me that somehow the journal form is the perfect literary form for capturing a human life. And so I set out to try and do that. But I think, because your reaction is very typical, I'm delighted to say, of people who read Any Human Heart. And my feeling is that it's because it's written that way. But it seems artless, and it seems, as you say, quiet, or nothing much happens, but you're held because it's like everybody's life. Thank you. Yes, in front here.
Hello, thank you very much, Mr. Boyd. I work at a radio station that you were at this morning.
Oh, right.
And they knew I was a big fan, so they told me, so I polished my shoes. And I brought in my books for you to sign, and they told me you were in at 11 o'clock, and you were in at 10 o'clock.
Oh,
so
right, sorry.
Would you mind signing my books later is my
Sure,
first
no
question.
problem.
Thank
no
you.
Problem, yeah.
And the second question is, as someone who's just named a dog Logan, your names of your characters can be incredible. I'm just wondering, do they come at the start? Is the name the first thing you have? Does it come late in the process, or is it always a little bit different for each character?
No, I think it's a very good point. I think it's very important how you name your characters, and I take enormous care as I christen them. Even the most minor walk-on role, you know, characters only in for a page or two. I think it's a sort of trick of the trade in a way, that there are perfectly good names like, you know, James Thompson or Sally Brown, but they don't do much for you. So I try always to create a name that is just slightly strange, not Dickensian, Mr. Squeers or whatever, Jenny Wren, but names that have a very slight spin to them. For example, the central character of New Confessions is called John James Todd. If he's called John Todd, it might not be so interesting, but calling him John James Todd suddenly makes his name memorable. And I collect names. If I see an interesting name, I'll write it down. I'll give you an example. I was writing my third novel, and I was about to write it, and I hadn't got a name for my character, and I went to a garage to hire a car. And the big glass doors of this garage were being replaced. And the workmen who were working on that had on their overalls the name Henderson Doors, Doors. And I thought, that's rather a good name, Henderson Doors. So I wrote it down, but I changed it to Dores, and hence the name of the character in Stars and Bars is called Henderson Doors. It's a perfectly plausible name, but it's slightly odd. And so all my characters, I would say, have interesting names that just verge on the slightly eccentric. But it's a deliberate attempt to make them memorable, because I think if you name a character well, you don't call him, Martin Brown, perfectly good name, in case there are any Martin Browns in the audience. If you call him Sholto Farr, as I have in this novel, perfectly good Scottish name, but it's memorable, and instantly I think the character comes alive on the page to a certain extent. Even before you've described what he or she looks like, somehow the name has a resonance, and in the reader's mind has a place. So I do take enormous pains to get the names right, and I'm always on the lookout for interesting Christian names and interesting surnames, and conjoining them for my novels. Yes?
Hi. This one? Yeah, hi. One of the things I've noticed in your novels quite frequently is that you start at the end in a flashback, right, going back to the New Confessions and all the way up to the new one. I'm wondering, what is it that draws you to essentially starting at the end, and how that might affect the way the reader reads the book if they start at the last year of her life or something, and then we're shoved right back to the start?
Well, it's actually, as I suggested earlier, it's actually a form of structural sleight of hand in a way, because a simple chronological telling of a story requires you to tell everything. As soon as you fracture a narrative, you're in a position to elide, to cover a lot of ground quite neatly. So in the case of these long novels where I'm dealing with entire lives, actually Any Human Heart was very hard because I was going chronologically. In the case of these long novels, it's often technically, structurally, a good idea to fracture the narrative, to move around through time, so that you don't have to cover every single month of every single year that person lived. But the curious effect of doing that is that the reader has a feeling of massive richness of detail. Sweet Caress is 450 pages long, so it's quite a long novel, but it does cover 70 years of a person's life. And you feel, I think, when you finish the novel, that you know everything about Amory. You know what she was doing in every given year she was living, pretty much. So it's a kind of novelistic technique to allow you to get a quart into a pint pot. And I fracture narrative a lot, actually. Particularly in my short stories, I've experimented with all sorts of tricksy time schemes to see how much you can do with a non-chronological narrative. But I think in the case of New Confessions and Sweet Caress, it's simply a way of allowing you to cover all the ground without laboriously covering the ground, if you know what I mean. Another question there? Sorry.
Hi. I'm fascinated by the link between photography and the narrative. I'm really interested in the story of Vivian Mayer. And also, I remember watching a drama, a Stephen Polyakov drama a number of years ago called Shooting the Past, where they use the breaking up of a photographic collection to tell an amazing story that kind of swirls around. So that's why I'm particularly looking forward to reading the book. So I don't know whether that's a question, but I just wanted to say, were you aware of either of those?
Well, I mean, Vivian Mayer's story, I think, has broken relatively recently, in the last 2 or 3 years, I think. I've seen her photographs, I'm aware of her. And I mean, she didn't really influence this book, but I think there's a certain kind of photographer, she was a street photographer, like Robert Frank, or a particular favorite of mine, American photographer called Saul Leiter, who died just, I think, a year ago, who is an amazing photographer of street life, very much in the Vivian Mayer mode, but perhaps more stylistically conscious. His photographs are beautifully composed and beautifully framed. All manner of, at the end of my book, I have a long list of names of women photographers in the main who sort of inspired me, but in actual fact Vivian Mayer wasn't one of them, because I was looking at women photographers of the 30s and the 40s and 50s and the 60s in particular. So they were the ones that whose monographs I bought and whose photographs I looked at. And but again, it's the idea of that snatched moment that I think appeals to my taste in particular. I think that all the photographers I really like, and I've mentioned a few of them, like Jacques-Henri Lartigue, who started taking photographs as a boy before the First World War, is a remarkable photographer. They're all snapshots, and then you get Brassai, Paris by Night. Cartier-Bresson is essentially a great taker of frozen moments of time. Robert Frank, so on and so forth. But those are the photographers that appeal to me, and I've analyzed why they do appeal to me. I actually have written a long essay about my theory of photography, if any of you are interested, which is in my book Bamboo, and it's called 13 Ways of Looking at a Photograph, in which I say there are only 13 types of photograph. Some of them overlap a bit. It was a challenge to the world, but I actually think there are 14 types of photographs now. But the category I missed out was the misshot, or as it's known, or the bad crop, the photograph that isn't what you meant to take, but very often is a fantastic photograph. Somebody's head is half out of the frame, but it's a brilliant photograph. So again, it's that snapshot moment. So I was very influenced by all manner of photographers in constructing Amory's career, though she does change styles, and she takes very boring photographs as well as very interesting ones. She takes bad photographs. There's a photograph in the book which she wins a prize for, which is a bad crop. So it's that the influence of living photographers, real photographers, is present there, and reflects to a degree the taste that I have. Anyway, I think we have to wind up there. Thank you all very much. Thanks for your questions.